Suicidology and compassionate inquiry both speak to the deep emotional pain. Suicidology is its own study of suicide, which is very different from the way psychology and psychiatry may look at it. Suicidology looks at it as a deep emotional pain of the psyche that comes from unmet needs, very linked into trauma and unmet needs from childhood. We want to be mindful. We're saying, we see your pain, and I'm giving your pain language, validation, acceptance. And then maybe when I trust you to listen and not make it about, oh, what is wrong with you, or I think you need help, is seeing what I am going through, is then offering me help. And then the next step would be to seek professional help, psychologist help, a support system along with family, loved ones, as the person goes through their own journey of uncovering what's causing the pain. Because you're not any of this. You're not the part that wants to end its life. There's this part that's asking for help as well. There's a living side that so deeply cares for you. And it takes me back to A.H. Alma's that Gabor talks about, where he says that this is exactly where it wants you to look. That really shifted that for me.
This is the Gifts of Trauma podcast. Stories of transformation and healing through compassionate inquiry. Welcome to the Gifts of Trauma podcast. I'm Rosemary Davies-Janes, and today I'm speaking with Nyana Sabharwal. Nyana, it's such a delight to have you here. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much, Rosemary.
It's a total delight. You're more than just the psychotherapist. Everyone is so multidimensional. I wonder if you'd like to share that before we really get into the work. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. So I think I'll first say I'm human, living the human experience and recognizing the multidimensionality of all of us, the lives that we have, the choices we make, the decisions we live. And in all of that, there is humanness to it.
I love the smile as you're sharing this. There's a big smile on your face.
Yes, because for the longest time, I thought that everyone else had it perfectly and I was perfectly imperfect. Broken, bruised. This journey has been beautiful to recognize what it is to be human and what it is to be divine at the same time. To find that the journey of healing is exactly that journey. Being a psychotherapist allows me to create that bridge and also possibly put my hand out to people to say, hey, that is possible for you. Would you like to go on this journey with me? Mm-hmm. And whatever that looks like and the form that it takes is unique, but it allows me to tell people that being human is messy and not easy. None of us have it down. And welcome aboard. For me, whether it's a psychotherapist or any other certifications, is just a way to show up and say, this is what I do in this journey of being human.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Now, at this point in your life, what would you say you've discovered as your purpose for being here on this planet as a human right now?
I would say it is just being human. And in being, moving away from everything that is taught to us as human doing to human being. And that we already are everything that we seek and look for. And to find that experience within in every moment. And the experience is of safety and of presence and being a compassionate experience within oneself to create that between me and so-called other. And I think that has been the unique experience of what I see is the purpose of being here. to have people look at a different perspective to this journey of life.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, I'd like to go a little bit into your professional specialties because you have quite a lot listed. You work with people in addiction, anxiety, people suffering from codependency, depression. You help people through divorce and eating disorders, grief and loss, parenting, self-esteem, sexual abuse, insomnia. You work with spirituality and ritual. You help people with stress, substance use and abuse, trauma and PTSD, and women's health. That's a really broad range of specialties. And from reading your bio on your website, it seems that you've experienced a number of these conditions yourself. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about your personal journey.
Thank you, Rosemary. All of these that I stated were parts of my human experience. Growing up in a family that had a parent who had an addiction, a mental illness, undiagnosed back in the day. We're talking about India, where even today, mental illness is still considered to be shameful, has taboo. We hide it. We don't want to let people know because we're an honor-based society. And the polarity of honor, the flip side is shame. So having anything that is not perfect on the outside is very neatly wrapped and tucked away. And we still live with that. It's still everything that we talk about or I've talked about there is even getting people to recognize it is hard or accept and acknowledge. So getting help is a whole different conversation. Moving back 30 years when I had a parent who had this and who ultimately succumbed to the battle, ended her life. And when you grow up in that environment with a parent with addiction, there are naturally a lot of byproducts like physical abuse that occurs between my father and mother, for example. Just the nature of the violence that was present. And when there aren't present parents, as Gabor talks about, a person knows when the child does not have protection and so experience sexual abuse growing up. And the implications of what that does to you as an individual in the absence of present, attuned safety and parents who can support, provide you that regulation is not available. You turn out to be a very dysregulated, emotionally imbalanced, extremely scared person trying to face the world that has its own unique challenges every day. And I ran to some of these things, whether it was substances, alcohol became something that was easy for me to use, but then I didn't like who I was on the substance. And it became another trigger for me every time I used a substance. Or it affected my ability to have interpersonal relationships. It just did not allow me to be in my body with safety. And so I was living in a more disassociated state for most part of my life until I came to a space and recognized that Gabor was saying something that was speaking to me about me. And that's really the reason why all of these are ways in which I hope to support people recognize that the journey of healing is first a choice, and second, that it is possible to live a very different existence from what we think we know.
Very good point. Very good point. It's so fascinating. And what you have shared about your cultural background is supported by some Indian immigrants that I became friends with in Canada. But what you've really described is a toxic culture. As Gabor says in his most recent book, it seems like such a mosaic when you look at Indian culture, because on one hand, you've got all of the deep, ancient Vedic wisdom. I think when people think stereotypically about India, they think of gurus, they think of spirituality, they think of yoga, they think of ashrams, they think of Ayurveda. On the other hand, you've got this honor and shame dynamic going on. And I know from some of my friends, alcoholism and sexual abuse, marital abuse, it's huge. Is it confusing? What's the experience when you're on the inside looking out? There's all of these different mosaic pieces that are brought together. I suppose they are in any culture. Can you talk a little bit about that? What it's like from the inside versus how it might appear to outsiders?
Yeah, absolutely. Over the years, the recognition that I've had through my own journey of healing is a lot of change in my own perspective about the culture. We are a culture that has been plundered for years. We've come from a deep history of trauma where we were for 150 years under the British rule. And prior to that, it was Mughals. We've had a long history of abuse as part of our existence. In receiving abuse, keeping quiet to protect oneself has almost become the nature of life.
That makes sense. It's a post-colonial trauma because the impact of colonization around the world is huge, but to have been colonized and under British rule for 150 years, that's a lot of generations that have been subjected to either toe the line or pay the price.
Absolutely. We were a culture and are a culture predominantly of spiritualism, the gurus, the knowledge. A lot of beauty came out of India, but we also went through, in all honesty, the dark ages. Today, we still grapple with both of that. There is a lot of trauma history that rests in our epigenetics, where staying quiet, accepting abuse is almost become normalized. And we accept it. We accept it as stay quiet and don't let anyone else know. And then receiving help is very difficult. Again, because of the shame that is wrapped around what it should look like on the outside versus what's really happening on the inside. If you look at it as the human existence, that's what it is. It's us covering up our darkness to show our light side all the time and running away from our imperfections. That's what we are doing today as a culture. We've moved fairly far away from that deep knowledge that actually is also a part of us. And I see that it's slowly coming back in all honesty, a culture that has mixed up somewhere abuse and love, the way I see it.
Can you say a bit more about that?
So there are a lot of things we do in a very abusive way and say, I'm doing it for your own good. And so when somebody is either violating my boundary or raising their hand on me, I'm saying, okay, somewhere this is for my own good.
It's really quite fascinating how these bits and pieces of colonial domination filter into the culture of the people who are being dominated.
And then that's how we've gotten conformity and obedience to the British for years, right? And it became about survival. When did that become a practice of normalized ways of disciplining, punishing, and believing that's good for either the child or the family? That is something I ponder a lot, but also understanding that's where it's come from. Before, it used to bring up a lot of anger because I couldn't understand when it happened to me growing up. How can someone love me and do this to me? It was this deep dissonance and conflict within as a child. Then what is love?
It's so appropriate that we are having this conversation through the lens of safety, presence, and attunement. And if I can redirect us a little bit, I'm sure that the people who are referred to you or find you through your website get to understand that you've actually experienced what they're experienced. That must make them feel so safe to share openly with you and probably gives them the courage to initiate their own healing journey in a culture where honor is paramount. I also understand that confidentiality is rare. You don't want what you're sharing with your therapist to somehow go outside those safe walls of confidence. I think offering the safety and presence and attunement as someone who's gone through this journey herself is got to make a big difference for your clients.
I think coming in and saying that you talk about your mother's suicide so openly, or you talk about her mental illness. I've had a lot of conversations around it, because shame, the natural is silencing, right? It's the most silencing emotion. Silence hurts nobody except the one who's keeping quiet. Right? It serves everybody as long as we are quiet.
And what does it do to the person who's keeping quiet and holding all that within? What drives you to be open about something that I'm gathering is rather taboo in your culture?
To me, it came to a point of life or death. If I keep keeping quiet and stuffing it down, I don't think I'm going to make it. I don't think I have what it takes to continue to live on. When you take away that expression of one's truth, of their experience, of what they may be feeling, it's saying you don't exist.
How does it feel to feel you don't exist? It's not real.
I used to call myself dead man walking. I was a body. I did what I had to do, but there was no sense that I existed at all, that I mattered. It was just complete shutdown. There wasn't any life or living in me. I think in a lot of ways, when you take away the existence, your expression of who you are, your authenticity, then what is left of you anyway? It is a body. And then the body copes with the pain, and then the pain is all you feel. And what is it is that you only feel pain and you're still quiet and you are suffering in silence.
How did it manifest for you, that pain?
In a lot of what I saw as dysregulated states, I was constantly hypervigilant. It didn't feel safe to speak anywhere, so I was quiet a lot of the times. I didn't have an opinion. I just allowed things to happen to me. I didn't even know I could say no, that it was valid or will be received. Then the use, of course, of alcohol to help numb a lot of the pain. Everything, you try something, it helps for some time, and then you try something else. I tried ending my life. There was a lot of anger, a lot of rage in a lot of spaces. And I was either deadened or in a lot of pain. And every time the pain came, I did something to distract it, like alcohol or with just screaming out to myself, doing self-sabotaging behaviors. And all of it was, oh, what is wrong with you? And that kept the message going for me that there was something wrong with me. I believed it.
I hear you. It's a difficult story to share, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Just take a couple of breaths. While you do that, I'm going to read a quote that really struck me from your website. And it's me quoting you. You were talking about your healing journey, and you said medication alone didn't work, and neither did therapy. It was only after I added meditation to calm the mind, yoga to heal trauma in the body, and chakra work to release blocked trauma energy that I finally started to find myself again. I think that's a beautiful quote. We've referred to scientific approaches and holistic approaches. From your perspective, is the scientific separation of mind, body, and spirit, combined with the overwhelming social isolation many people experience living as we do in our modern culture. Do you find that those two things, the isolation and the medical separation of our parts, are contributing to the massive increase in depression, anxiety, and suicide? That's a big question. But after I read that quote, I thought you would have a unique perspective.
I think that's a brilliant question. Thank you for asking that. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand suicidality, and I don't think we still have the answers from science, and that's the honest truth. What I speak here is my own journey and what I see with the journey of those that I work with. And there may not be any research to confound what I'm saying here today. Because I think by design, science takes away things it cannot measure. And the spirit is one that you cannot measure. And so, what happens to a human being when the spirit is beaten down from the very beginning? And expression of who I am and my authenticity is beaten down from the very beginning. Disconnection sets into who I am. And that I am is the disconnection of my inner voice, my inner truth. And so what are you left with is a body on hyper alert and a mind that's going on saying, am I safe? Am I here? Am I enough? Who am I? And that is essentially the deep suffering that we are seeing, because we're supposed to fit into a structure and a system that was built for conformity when the soul is free. And we seek that level of freedom that these structures cannot contain, and therefore easier to say it does not exist.
Yeah, beautifully said. You just took me on a quick journey there back to when all of this started, which I see it started in earnest with the Industrial Revolution. Industry and factories and jobs and workers have to be shaped as widgets to fit the machine of capitalism, production, development, growth. What you described as the mind and body separated from the soul, which I see as authenticity, and the spirit, which I see as our interconnectedness with all living beings. You almost have a drone. It's got a mind and a body, but without those other two key elements, the authenticity and the intraconnection, we're just automatons, as you described. And when that mind has no connection to soul and spirit, it's a machine that can get out of sync so easily. And when the mind is out of sync, the body is out of sync, and it doesn't have these other two components to add the additional, very necessary regulations.
Yeah, I think those two, the spirit and the soul, is the necessary grounding and anchoring of the being in this human experience.
Yeah.
And I always say that what we're trying to create is capitalism and factory and products. I think today the human has become the product. When you take that away, then we're just a product on a conveyor belt trying to create the same person, trying to have the same experience. And what we're taking away is the uniqueness of each individual that is created on this earth with very clear purposes. Each tree and each flower and each sentient being is. And that anyone not being here can fundamentally transform the balance of existence. We're left with people questioning today in the suffering of everything that I've written in what we work with is, why am I here? Do I deserve to exist? Am I worthy of existence? And we've created a structure that says, prove it.
Something that Gabor speaks about is the modern epidemic of isolation. He cites statistics that show loneliness doubles every decade, and that the impact of loneliness on physical health is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. From your perspective, how can people who feel isolated or are isolated in very real ways by poverty, lack of mobility, or other health issues find supportive communities? How can they reconnect to their spirit?
People can have a room full of people and still be very alone and lonely. So that brings up the question of physical isolation. The second is social norm isolation, like you've talked about, like poverty and other factors that isolate people. And in our country, when somebody dies by suicide as a bereaved family, there's a lot of isolation around the stigmas, shame, and taboo that comes with it. And then there is, of course, isolation and loneliness in itself in each individual, because we've lost connection to spirit and soul, the connection in itself. Even if I see families today, they might be all at a table, but all on their phones. We can take away and put people in a row, but are we in a space where we want to connect to each other in that authenticity, with that intimacy, to look at one another and connect? And that's the same experience of loneliness that I see with the people that work with them and my journey in reconnecting back to the parts of myself. When you're disconnected, that loneliness sets in, that isolation sets in. You start living more in your mind than in your being. It's when you find spaces of safety that I think connection and community really comes alive. And so if you ask me that question, can we build safe spaces where whatever you say is welcome, who you are is welcome, how you show up is welcome, and let be in that authentic experience of what it is to be in each other's space, in each other's energy, and connect. And that was what we tried to create with the support groups of families who were bereaved, who were isolated. We know that those who are bereaved, 60% go on to have thoughts of suicide themselves. It's that isolating, the guilt, and everything else that is unique to the complex grief of a suicide loss further isolates and makes it a very lonely experience. And the idea was to come in and say, stay quiet if you want. Come in and be in the experience of others who have had a similar experience. And when you are safe, you will speak at a time that feels right for you. And in a culture where there's so many paradigms and normatives of what it is to be normal, what it is to be okay, do's, don'ts, how you need to show up, safety is, I think, being eroded, especially if you come from trauma. The core is safety. Am I safe? Will I be heard? Will there be a reaction? Will there be a repercussion? Will there be punishment? There's so much going on inside that it's safer to be alone and isolated.
I think you've offered a brilliant solution, is bringing the individuals into a gathering where many people can be together and realize every time a community gathers like that, we realize that we're so much more alike each other than we are different.
Yeah.
And there's safety in that. It's like we're all going through different experiences, but there are big similarities. So what I'd like to explore next is, I have been blessed in that I haven't had anyone in my immediate circle experience death by suicide, but there have been deaths. And what I've seen is that when there's bereavement, most well-meaning friends and family members say absolutely inappropriate things to each other. And I can only imagine how much worse that is when there's death by suicide. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how we, as caring friends and family members, could offer meaningful support to someone who either struggles with deep depression or has lost someone through suicide. What do you say?
So I'm going to speak for not just myself, but everyone in the support group as well, and those who live back with the deep pain of that loss, because it is a different loss. People view you, there's a different perception that comes with that loss. So several things I think are happening. And I think it's the core of the human being to create some distance between me and you in a loss like this, that I'm not you and so it won't happen to me. It's happened to you, but it won't happen to me. And it's very difficult for the person who wants to provide that support to have to sit with their own fear as well as the pain of another. And that is being attuned and regulated into what's happening for me and present for me, that I recognize, hey, this is my fear. And my fear wants me to separate from you in your pain. And yet I want to be there for you. I say that because I hold compassion sometimes for those who do not know what to say and may say things that are sometimes harmful unknowingly and unconsciously. To say, I hear that fear and that need for separation, because I wouldn't want that to be my truth and reality. And it's taken me this long to say this with compassion. There was a lot of bitterness, resentment, anger towards people who have come and said some questions. But I sometimes think that we want to know what happened, why it happened, and try to make sense for it for ourselves as somebody who's trying to provide that support. And I think something that compassionate inquiry really taught me was to ask, who's the question for? If it is to provide support to someone else, then all we really need to do is to listen to the grief of the other and hold space in the recognition that there is a lot of pain and in what the person is experiencing, without me needing to add anything to make it better, save you, or rescue you. But I can just hold space and be with you, and that's compassion in your pain. Sometimes words are not needed.
I appreciate you saying that, because what you've just clarified for me is that the people who want to know what to say actually want to be recognized for saying something helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Yes.
about them, not about the person who's bereaved.
Yes.
So really offering a hug if that's appropriate and saying, I feel for you. I'm here for you. If you'd ever like to talk, I would love to be your listener.
Just listening, and so being mindful of saying, I'm here to listen.
Yep.
And I don't need to be helpful. I can't take that pain away. I can't make it any better. But if I listen with compassion and hold that space through your journey of verbalizing, there will be an alchemy that will produce itself, your truth and what you hold in your narrative. If that is able to be held, and really that's the word I want to say, if you can just hold that, the person will find their own peace and closure in time.
Beautifully said. Thank you. As we're speaking about your work in suicide prevention, intervention, and post-intervention, I have done some research into segments of the population that are most susceptible to suicide. I've also looked at countries with the highest suicides rates. And yes, there are reasonably recent statistics. The statistics I found were from 2 years ago. I've looked at stats on gender, age, nationality, socioeconomic factors, people facing financial hardships or serious health issues. But what I learned through all this research is that suicide is statistically impossible to predict from a scientific perspective. There are so many moving parts, so many factors. Can you share with us your perspective of what might predispose someone to suicidal ideation?
Biology, psychology, past history, and current events sort of an experience for a person. Because biology could be, am I male, female? And we know that more females attempt, but more males die by suicide, just by the process of lethality that is used. There is sexuality. We know that depending on the culture that you are, LGBTQIA has a large percentage of the population, lack of acceptance. The culture in itself is not very welcoming. And so that's your biology. And then there is a psychology, which says, is there a mental illness, for example? Is there a history of it? Is there any other predispositions of illnesses that might be leading to depression, anxiety, and other forms of mental illnesses? The most being trauma. how many people are experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma, because that impacts my coping mechanisms, that impacts my window of tolerance, that impacts my dysregulation, that impacts so many other factors, poverty, access. And then there is current events. Is that ongoing? And all of this is ongoing. However, there is a nuance that is there in our culture today, globally interconnected, which was the pandemic. And I don't know if you had read that the study was done post the Spanish influenza, where there was a discussion around the probability of increase in post-traumatic stress disorder post a pandemic like that. And they saw that with the Spanish influenza. There might be an increase in suicidality 2 to 5 times. And we do live in a post-pandemic era. And we do know the struggles we faced. And we may be seeing some of this in our population. I want to put that perspective in to say we need to be mindful of our well-being and our mental health now more than ever.
Yeah.
We also have to look at what was happening within families during those times, what were happening in homes during those times. The levels of stress and abuse had risen. Access to, for those with substance use, access to substances were not available, or not its a coping mechanism. And we're looking at so much of that from that angle, apart from it being a pandemic, that we need to bring into the conversation of where are we today in our mental health, our ability to recognize what we have just come out of, and have you really come out of it, because there are after effects.
Yeah, for sure. And if I may add a little dark humor here, one thing that always baffled my mind during the COVID epidemic in Canada, supermarkets were open, you could buy food, and liquor stores were open. You could buy alcohol. Not much else. But I thought, how interesting. And in Canada, the liquor stores are controlled by the government. The government was making sure that people could buy as much alcohol as they wished to buy. We could get food, what was on the shelves, but the liquor stores always seemed to be pretty well stocked. And they were always long, because of course, back then, the masks and the lineups, there were limited number of people in the stores. There was always a long line waiting at the government-controlled liquor stores. It just struck me as very odd at the time. So certain substances were available to Canadians during that period.
We did have that in India.
Yeah.
There was a very long line of people. I only imagine what it might have been, having lived with somebody with alcohol dependence, what that might have been for them in their struggle, therefore for family in coping with that.
Yeah. Because I know certain countries, South Africa, it was all shut down. Like you could get food, but that was it. It was different from country to country, but just an interested observation. If we go back to our conversation on suicidal ideation, are there any clues? This is probably a very broad question for something that shows up very specifically, but I've heard many people who have been personally touched by the death of a loved one by suicide, and they feel blindsided. I never saw it coming, was something I hear a lot. So are there any clues that if someone's acting as if they are perhaps not on their game, a little depressed, are there any clues that might signal suicidal ideation?
So as a suicide first responder, in my training, we learn that there will be clues. The clues could go from subtle to quite blatant, as somebody might say, I wish I was just dead. And we may take these statements as the person saying it. And then we recommend inquiry into what do you mean when you say that. Most, we may not be present to that being necessarily a clue. But when I've done psychological autopsies, or even with a support group, when we look back, hindsight is cruel, we begin to see these clues. And so there are clues in you may see a change in mood and behavior. Not to say that all of these is signs of suicide, but when there is, the invitation is, let's ask if there is any sort of thought of not being around here anymore. And people will say, you will see the mood shift, or if the mood is really low, suddenly you'll see an upliftment and happiness, and you're wondering what just shifted. It also could mean that now they have made a decision or a choice. They'll start giving things away. They may say goodbyes. They may say, okay, let me speak to all these people. They may call up and apologize for things they have done in the past. They will possibly let you know, I wish I wasn't alive. I just want to end my life. This has become too much. I'm too tired. This is too painful. In young children, they may say things like, I want to go to sleep and never wake up. Or I want to go to a deceased person's, for example, if it's a grandparent, they may say, I want to go to my grandparent. Different, of course, age groups have different ways of verbalizing these cues. You may start seeing more self-destructive behaviors as well, more risk-taking, for example, giving away possessions. You may start seeing the accumulation of means and wants, sharp objects, etc. Being aware and mindful that this is shifting and the person is acting out of their ordinary behavior. And that is unique to each individual as well. And we have a natural radar for something's not okay. And the invitation is tap into that radar and ask the person, invite them into a conversation of, hey, I'm noticing XYZ changes. Would you like to talk about it? You mentioned these particular words. Are you thinking of suicide?
Mhm.
And the person may say and may not say, that's not. And that's what I think the clues are really for somebody to say, somebody notice, I need help.
The clues could be perceived as a cry for help.
Definitely. Person doesn't go from a thought of suicide to doing it. There is a period in between in which there is planning and preparing. It's during those times that they will verbalize or develop behavior, or you may see shifts that the person is possibly thinking about not being here anymore.
Other than inquiring and having those conversations, is there anything else we could do that would be supportive to them?
I think the first step is to ask about it, because if I am showing you the sign, I want you to respond. When I'm seen and heard, that's the first step to opening up the conversation of saying, let me get you help or support. What that look like? Suicidology is its own study of suicide, which is very different from the way psychology and psychiatry may look at it. Suicidology looks at it as a deep emotional pain of this or psyche that comes from unmet needs, very linked into trauma and unmet needs from childhood. And in saying that I'm not having this conversation, I may be giving the message that I think there's something wrong with you. We want to be mindful. We're saying, we see your pain, and I'm giving your pain language, validation, acceptance. And then maybe when I trust you to listen and not make it about, oh, what is wrong with you? Or I think you need help. Because there's so much taboo around these things. I'm just being mindful of that. The person will say, okay, this person is seeing what I am going through, recognizes it's real, is then offering me help. And then the next step would be to seek professional help almost immediately. Psychologist help, a support system along with family, loved ones, as the person goes through their own journey of uncovering what's causing the pain, is what I think the person would need.
Appreciate that. And I also appreciate you bringing suicidology into the conversation, because something that goes back to the distinction, Gabor, in the realm of the hungry ghost has a totally different approach to addiction. And one of our previous guests spoke about the impact, seeing that different perspective. And Gabor asks why the pain, which was in sharp contrast to the 12-step program he was in, which was asking him to document all the people he'd hurt, and a process that made him feel worse and worse about the addiction. Gabor's question, what's the pain or what's the substance doing for you? How is it helping with the pain? So I'm wondering, between standard psychology, suicidology, and the compassionate inquiry approach, is there anything that you offer to people who are struggling with suicidal ideation that's shaped by your compassionate inquiry training that offers them a different perspective?
Yeah, I think suicidology and compassionate inquiry both speak to the deep emotional pain. Through both studying suicidology and reading the work and the literature that comes out of there with the richness of compassionate inquiry, is the presence of the question, why the pain? What might you be really escaping from? Let's talk about that pain. Because you're not any of this. You're not the addiction. You're not the part that wants to end its life. There's this part that's asking for help as well. There's a living side that so deeply cares for you. And it takes me back to A.H. Almaas that Gabor talks about a lot, where he says that this is exactly where it wants you to look. It may not be easy to say that to somebody who was in the pain at that point of time, but that really shifted that for me. These are all yours, but they're here and designed for you to come closer home to self. And so where is the disconnection? What is really happening, or what hasn't been expressed? What has been held in? What has been disconnected? The question is, if I took this pain away, what might that be for you? And then the choice to live is natural. And so then the pain is something that we can work with.
Are people surprised to discover what the pain is that's been driving all of these thoughts and all this preparation? Can you share a little bit about that? Maybe a story?
Yes, absolutely. I think with compassion inquiry, just holding space that there is pain, I thought I was just like this. And so that separates me, the true self, who I am, from this pain that is in me. Right? And that Gabor does so beautiful. He says, I am, and then experiencing this particular pain, right? I'm not the pain. And that separation is, if I'm not the pain, then I can do something about it.
It would be for them to say, I'm not suicidal. I'm experiencing pain that is making me contemplate suicide.
Have thoughts of ending my life. And then the separation between that, the thought of ending a life is just one part of me, but there's another part that also loves me enough to want to be here every day to find out more. And the invitation, again, from compassionate inquiry is to remain curious with the pain and what it wants us to see, and it's here. And what is it really doing and saying and verbalizing? And then when you do the work, it's a younger part, or it goes back into a childhood experience, or, oh my God, I didn't realize it goes back all the way there. I thought this was just who I am, a mess up, a F up, a good for nothing, I'm a burden. All of these beliefs that were created over time, that is causing the pain. And then a step further, that it's not even the trauma alone, but what we make it mean about us. And then it goes into this journey of possibility of self-discovery.
And I'd love for you to speak about that. But first, I'd just like to share with the audience who can't see you the look of delight on your face as you were describing this inner exploration that you take people through. I'm sure you were mirroring exactly the expressions you saw on their faces. This isn't about what I thought it was about. This goes back to when I was 12 and my sister died and I chose this and I decided this and I started believing that. And it's, whoa, I didn't realize it went back that far. So yes, please carry on.
And I think that the difference is from seeing myself as this mess up, and I'm able to see myself with maybe a little hope that I don't have to live with this pain forever. And of course, it's not a single path. There are different things that took me on my own healing journey. Sometimes there's medication, there's therapy, there's honoring the soul and the spirit and spirituality and yoga. We create and allow the person to recognize that it's all different dimensions of the human experience that we then connect to in this journey.
Yeah, beautiful. I'd like to read another quote, which is a quote by you. And you speak on your website, you say, it's my commitment to give people who have suffered the profound loss of a loved one to suicide a place to feel safe. And then you go on, it is a desire to support people in understanding and healing trauma, grief, and suicidality, and begin to reimagine and recover their true self and uncover the meaning and purpose in living. Healing is a journey, and the company matters. It's a beautiful quote. Could you speak a little bit about the journey once they have done some healing of the trauma and grief and suicidality and begin to reimagine and recover the meaning and purpose in living? Can you maybe share a story about that?
Yeah, it's not a linear process. Sometimes you take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back because life is happening simultaneously as we're building this journey. And the beauty of this one particular story was the ability to hold on to that part or that experience of having wanted to not be around anymore. As in a lot of cases, in their pain and their trauma was so severe, this part may also be a coping mechanism to say, it's always there at the background. As Gabor says, the substance is being used to cope. And the recognition that this part is here to cope while it finds its new way of being in the world. And that brings about the feeling of it's safe to be here. It's safe to come back into the body. It's safe to engage. So you're building safety step by step while the person recognizes that there is this part that did have the pain. And as the work happens, the pain begins to reduce in time. I don't feel that kind of pain as I used to before, or I don't feel that anxious anymore all the time, or I'm able to be without that fear sometimes. And it's those moments that are like, okay, if it's possible, then it's possible. And then I've seen clients who go on and have wanted to contribute something back. And that's something that we see a lot. Even with the support group, someone's written a book and says, now I want to give back and I want to be the voice to those who are bereaved. Or somebody else says, I've always wanted to do this as a child and now I feel I can go and do that. I wanted to be an artist. I'm going to go pursue that. You'll have to navigate life as it happens. And there will be times that you may see a client come back and said, I did that. It got overwhelmed. But you know what? The thought of suicide hasn't come back. I know that I can do this. I had quote unquote a relapse. I don't really like that word at all. Or I did, but I know that is not me. But I didn't feel shame and I didn't beat myself down and I didn't feel everything was over and that life was not worth living.
Yeah.
And I realized I thought they needed to have a purpose. But in just learning to see themselves operate differently itself is such a experience of honoring the self and life. And that seeing, oh, I can see the beauty around me. In that, they start finding their own gifts and what they enjoyed and loved. And different people have done different things.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. I understand why you don't like the word relapse. And you said 1 step forward, 1 step back, but it seems like it's not actually a step back. Maybe it's a step to the side.
Yes.
It's different. It's not replaying the old behavior. It's an adaptation of that behavior, which may not be forward moving, but it's not back to what was either. So beautiful. The word relapse totally does not fit that.
Yeah. And thank you for saying that, because sometimes for the person who's experiencing it, it may seem like, oh, I was doing so well and now I've gone back and I've made no progress. It is to remind that you aren't that person from 6 months ago. And that's, oh yeah, let's look at all the things that you could have done, but didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. And we have all of your contact information included in the show notes. So anybody who wants to learn more can reach out to Nyana. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and wisdom today. It's been beautiful.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for doing this, for having me, for having this important conversation. And truly thank you to everyone and all of us who hope to create a more compassionate world in which everyone is included.
The Gifts of Trauma is a weekly podcast that features personal stories of trauma healing, transformation, and the gifts revealed on the path to authenticity. Please note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for personal therapy or a DIY formula for self-therapy. We'd like to thank you for being here today, and we'd also like to thank our guests, as well as Gabor Mate, Sataram Kaur, and the Compassionate Inquiry admin team, marketing team, and podcast team. Please join us again next week to hear more stories of transformation and healing through Compassionate Inquiry.